America's top diplomat, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has just arrived in Geneva as delegations from Ukraine and the United States, as well as European security chiefs, meet to discuss President Trump's 28-point plan to end the Russia-Ukraine war. The proposals would require Ukraine to cede territory and reduce the size of its army. President Trump had set a deadline of Thursday for President Zelensky to accept the draft deal, but he's since said it's not his final offer. Ukraine's allies in Europe have pushed back on major provisions in the draft, which has not been made public, but details of which have been widely leaked. EU leaders released a statement saying the plan includes important elements that will be essential for a just and lasting peace, but goes on to say the draft is a basis that will require additional work. It also adds that leaders are concerned by the proposed limitations on Ukraine's armed forces, which they say would leave the country in a vulnerable position. The British, French and German leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Johannesburg to discuss the US proposals. Sir Keir Starmer said Ukraine's friends and partners remain committed to securing a lasting peace once and for all. Well, as we mentioned, today's talks are taking place in Geneva, from where our correspondent Imogen Folks reports.
The talks in Geneva are set to last just one day, but there is so much to discuss. The US plan was hatched without Ukraine and without its allies in Europe. It has elements they find deeply worrying: giving up land to Russia, forgetting about joining NATO, reducing Ukraine's armed forces. That looks to Kyiv like rewarding Moscow's aggression. Meanwhile, Russian attacks on Ukraine continue. Britain, France and Germany say they support the effort towards peace, but that this plan needs work.
I think it is important to say that one of the elements in the 28-point plan is the security guarantee from the US, an Article 5 guarantee. That's about the strongest guarantee that can be put forward. And so that fortifies in me the belief that what we're all trying to achieve here is a just and lasting peace, but it'll only be just and lasting if there are security guarantees and if we bear in mind that matters for Ukraine are always to be determined by Ukraine.
Ukraine's European allies are now scrambling to draft an alternative plan and sending their own diplomats to Geneva. President Trump has said he would like Ukraine to decide whether or not to accept his plan by Thanksgiving. That's just 5 days to consider complex proposals to end a war now close to 4 years old. Imogen Folks, BBC News, Geneva.
Earlier I spoke to Imogen Folks. She explained what we know so far about how these talks will unfold today.
It's still a little bit murky for us journalists. We know that there will be talks held at the US diplomatic mission. We think that's going to be with between the United States and the Ukrainian delegation. It's not entirely clear whether the Europeans, who've each sent their own security advisors to Geneva, including the UK's own Jonathan Powell, whether they will be included right at the start or whether Marco Rubio will then go and talk to them separately. He's also expected at the Geneva hotel that is the favoured choice of the United States round about early afternoon, and we're wondering whether they will have some talks with the Europeans. But I'm told for security operations, they're not going to tell us too much more. So for all of us, it's going to be probably quite long, cold wait. But we do know that Ukraine has at least its European allies in town and hopefully also in the room, which it will be grateful for, given that there is a lot in this plan that it's very concerned about, not least the idea of giving up quite a bit of its territory.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's now landed in Geneva for those Ukraine peace talks, insisted that the White House peace plan was drawn up by the US. He was responding to claims from 3 senators who say they'd been told by Mr. Rubio that it was a Russian wish list. From Washington, here's our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman.
Well, these 3 senators say they spoke to Mr. Rubio as he was on his way to Geneva, and they were worried. They were concerned about the leaked document, this 28-point plan. Now, one of the senators, Mike Rounds, who's a Republican, he sits on the Senate Intelligence Committee, said that he had been really concerned that this just looked like the Russian position. And he said basically even the document itself, the wording of it, it felt like this was a Russian document. So he'd wanted clarification from Marco Rubio about how it had come about. Now, he says that Marco Rubio told the senators that this was a Russian proposal, that it was not an American proposal. It had been given to Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, and then it had leaked. Now, he said that, or the senators' understanding from what Mr. Rubio told them was that it had not leaked from the US administration, and one of them said it had leaked from the Russian representative. Now, the reason all of this matters is because the senators' account of what Marco Rubio told them is in direct contradiction to what the White House has been saying this week about the plan, because the White House says it's an American proposal. It was drawn up by Mr. Trump's officials, namely Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff, and that President Trump endorsed it. And I think all of that really speaks to a sense of dysfunction within the administration over this 28-point plan, over the negotiations. And it matters because you now have the Ukrainians and the Europeans in Geneva meeting with the Americans. The Ukrainians desperately worried that President Trump has pivoted towards Moscow, has given them an ultimatum that they have to respond to within a week. And incidentally, the senators said that Mr. Rubio told them that the threat to cut off American weapons supply and intelligence sharing, that he wasn't aware of that threat. So there's another contradiction there. Now, as for the report that, of what the senators have said, Mr. Rubio told them that this was not an American plan. The State Department spokesman has said that is blatantly false. And Mr. Rubio has posted on social media saying that this is a US-authored plan, he says, based on input from the Russians, but with previous and ongoing input from the Ukrainians. And he described this as a framework for negotiations.
Tom Bateman reporting. Earlier I spoke to John Foreman, who served as the UK Defence Attaché in Moscow between 2019 and 2022. He previously held the same role in Kyiv and says that in his view the Ukrainians and Europeans were right not to dismiss the plans outright, despite some key sticking points.
I think I'm glad that the Europeans didn't reject the plan out of hand. I'm glad that the Ukrainians also stayed calm and now in the room in Geneva. But I think there's some key sticking points, obviously, which I think the Europeans were right to point out. I mean, firstly is on Ukraine's sovereignty, both in terms of territory and also in terms of the armed forces. Secondly is about security guarantees. And also about sort of the broad principle of giving away or not changing borders by force. So I thought this measured statement in South Africa was good. I'm glad that the European national security advisors are in the room or around the room in Geneva. But ultimately, it'll come down to a face-to-face discussion with the Americans and the Ukrainians.
And do you think that they can make progress? I mean, it's a bit vague at the moment as to what the format of the talks is, but do you think that actually this is a forum where they can make progress? And do you think the deadline that President Trump set originally for Thursday has been helpful for getting to peace or a hindrance?
Well, certainly I think the deadline focuses minds, Thanksgiving, although I saw President Trump was slightly more flexible. But it's obviously the last few days has gingered up everybody to actually start focusing on the substance. I think on the plan itself, or the draft framework, as Senator Rubio said, is a framework for work, further development. I think the reaction that this was a take or leave it plan for the Americans was always wide of the mark. I think there was always room for further refinement, and hopefully that's what we will see in Geneva this weekend.
And what about some of the elements? Obviously, we don't have the details of the plan, but some of the elements that have been reported that are in there, that Russia might be readmitted to the G7, sanctions lifted, and new long-term agreements signed with the US. How important are those in terms of Russia as to whether it will be enough to make them stop the war?
I think the problem with the plan was presented in the 28-point plan. There was no prioritisation, and there's very little commitments placed onto Russia. For example, the first point is about Ukrainian sovereignty. Russia needs to agree to respect that. I think there needs to be conditionality as well. So it can't just be everything goes back to normal. There has to be conditions placed that this will happen, then maybe that will happen on the Russian side, and in particular on the easing of sanctions. And also, I think the second problem the plan has problems with is that it places demands on the Europeans and NATO to do this and that, which, of course, as the Europeans pointed out, they've got a right to do it. right to say, for example, admission of Ukraine into the European Union, or renegotiation or discussion with Russia on NATO points, or indeed the G8. I mean, there's other parties in the G8 or G7 which would have to agree to readmit Russia.